Hello and welcome to my video on funding community mental health programs. This is specifically for occupational therapists that are looking to become involved with justice-involved individuals and the criminal justice system. My name is Alexandra Oakdorf, and I am working with Life After Incarceration, Transition, and Reentry, also known as LATER, and I'm a student at Washington University in St. Louis in their program in occupational therapy. So I wanted to create a series of videos talking about each of my objectives. And one of those objectives for me was learning about funding and how this sort of programming does get funded and how we can increase our presence in this setting. I also wanted to talk in this video about occupational therapy's value, what we can actually add to this setting, and how we know that occupational therapy can increase the success of the criminal justice system and keep people out of corrections facilities and in their communities. So a little bit about the criminal justice system. First, I wanted to talk about some historical context. So a lot of statistics that you'll see relating to the criminal justice system will refer to the 80s. And the reason for that is the 80s is when the time of the war on drugs began. So that's when this country passed a lot of legislation that was harsher on drug-related crimes. So the incarceration rate grew 220% from 1980 to 2014. This country also holds about 25% of the global prison population, and that's more than any other country in the globe. There were 1.8 million individuals held in US jails and prisons in the year 2020, and that number is down from about 2.2 million individuals in previous years. The violent crime rate has fallen by a little under 40% since 1980. And I include that statistic because I think it's important, because I think sometimes it can get a little bit confused and maybe it can be a little misleading. So the violent crime rate has fallen more likely due to demographic changes and economic changes, more so than incarceration really working. We know that 95% of the incarcerated population will eventually be released to their communities, but 66% of those will reoffend and enter corrections facility again within 3 years. So we know that incarceration isn't really working and it's not necessarily keeping people in their communities. The average sentence in a state prison in 2016 was 2.6 years, and that's not including time spent in jail. The higher end of that range was around 15.4 years, and that was more for violent crimes. Based on a report from May of 2019, the average sentence for federal prison was 141 months or 11.75 years. And the difference between that range or those two averages is because federal prisons tend to have harsher sentences and more serious crimes. So the current crisis or different things that are important to know about the criminal justice system and how we know that, things aren't necessarily going well in the criminal justice system is that the cost associated with the criminal justice system has increased by over 70% in the last 2 decades. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics states that the government spends around $81 billion on the criminal justice system each year. However, others argue it's far more. So it really depends on what you're calculating, what you're including in that calculation, and more conservative options for this calculation think that it's closer to around $270 billion per year. But it really just depends. Some argue that it's important to consider the long-lasting effects of incarceration on physical and mental health, and how that ends up costing individuals a lot more money in the long run. In 2013, 11 states spent more on incarceration than education. And that's important to know, and it's unfortunate to know because we know that education is a protective factor against incarceration. So the fact that states are spending more on incarceration than education is shocking. New admission rates increased by 200% between the years 1984 and 2014 for technical violations of parole. So what exactly are technical violations? Those are not new crimes being committed, but they're violations of specific or general conditions of probation or parole. So that might include forgetting to update your address or your files, missing a curfew, missing an appointment with a PO. And I include this because I think occupational therapists that are working with this population should be very aware of a client's probation and parole guidelines in order to promote success with adhering to those guidelines. So an example that comes to mind is you might have a client who is wanting to make a lot of money, is wanting to work pretty often, and decides that they want to take on an extra shift. However, that extra shift may mean that they are now missing their curfew and are in violation of their parole. So those are important situations to work through and to address with your client as they come up. So a little bit about the context of the criminal justice system. Where exactly is the criminal justice system? Now, this list is by no means exhaustive, but it includes jails, prisons, probation departments, juvenile detention centers, forensic hospitals, which is where you might see more of a traditional occupational therapist, drug and alcohol treatment centers, and community corrections facilities. Now, of course, as I said, this is not an exhaustive list. You also will probably see justice-involved individuals in many settings where you might see more traditional occupational therapists. Other places where you might see justice-involved individuals is in homeless shelters. There's a pretty strong connection between individuals experiencing homelessness and incarceration. I also wanted to take a moment to explain the difference between jails and prisons, because I think those two words tend to be used interchangeably, but they do represent different corrections facilities. So jails are meant to be temporary, no more than a year to 2 years, and can be prior to sentencing or just if somebody has a pretty short sentence. And prisons are post-sentencing typically. Now, that's not really a hard and fast rule, especially now with COVID. A lot of facilities don't want to be moving people around if they don't have to. So we actually have a client who has been in a jail for longer than 2 years, much longer than 2 years, and has become very antsy, feels that there's not enough for him to do. And he's right, because jails don't have the infrastructure to hold people for that long. So those are important things to keep in mind. And I also include this slide because when occupational therapists are thinking about how to become involved with this population and how to provide rehabilitation to this population, it isn't just jails and prisons where occupational therapists are needed, but so many other areas where the criminal justice system exists. So a little bit about demographics. First of all, talking about race, it's pretty well known that minority populations are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. So 50% of the incarcerated population is Black or Hispanic, and Black and Hispanic individuals make up only 30% of the general population. So you're seeing more of those individuals being incarcerated versus their white counterpart. Health conditions that are pretty common within this population. Chronic conditions include diabetes, heart disease, cancer. Infectious disease that's pretty common includes HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, and COVID-19. Prisons and jails are hotspots for COVID-19 to spread super rapidly, and it's very concerning and important to know. Traumatic brain injury is pretty common within this population, as well as learning disabilities such as ADHD. Mental health problems are pretty common within this population as well. 50% have a mental health problem, but I would argue it's probably higher than that. Just thinking that maybe people are undiagnosed or going untreated for their mental health problem. And the reason that I say that is because of the common experience of anxiety and depression and the experience of incarceration as an extremely traumatic event. A lot of the individuals that we're seeing in the jails and prisons do have these issues, but it's just going untreated. The leading cause of death was death by suicide from 2000 to 2014. 70% regularly used drugs, 65% regularly used alcohol. This population also tends to be less educated, 65% not having completed high school and 14% having less than 8th grade. And this population also tends to be more impoverished, with 33% having received public assistance at some point in their lives. 10% were experiencing homelessness 1 year prior to incarceration. So what exactly is the value of OT in this setting? This list here is looking at criminogenic needs, or the different factors that may impact a person's likelihood to reoffend or to become involved with the criminal justice system. And those include attitudes, values, and beliefs, or looking more at cognition, risky thinking, peer association, so who's in their social circle, personality, looking at higher level cognitive skills of self-management, anger management, emotional regulation, leisure. So what exactly are they doing with their free time? Education and employment, substance use, and family factors. And for an occupational therapist, I think this list of criminogenic needs is extremely valuable because it is exactly what our domain is. So within the domain of occupational therapy, we are able to address education, work, leisure, social participation. We look at a client's values, beliefs, and spirituality in order to be more client-centered. We look at a person's process skills or their cognitive skills, social interaction skills, and their habits and routines, as well as so much more. We also look at IADLs, that is instrumental activities of daily living, which includes activities such as meal preparation, medication management, health management, and so much more. So talking to somebody who maybe doesn't know about occupational therapy, or maybe they do know about occupational therapy, but just don't see the value of it in this setting, this sort of information is extremely valuable to have in order to educate somebody and let them know that this population really does need rehabilitation, and here's why, and here's exactly how I can help you. So talking a little bit about funding, a lot of times grants and money that's available for this type of programming is available to nonprofit organizations. Now, of course, it's not a hard and fast rule. Of course, there are grants that are open to small businesses and for-profit organizations, but for the most part, being a nonprofit tends to be pretty beneficial for accessing funding. So what exactly is the difference between all of these? A nonprofit is your typical charitable organization, and it cannot be an action organization. So this sort of organization cannot be becoming involved in political matters. A not-for-profit is similar to a nonprofit, in that all of the money that they generate is going back into the organization, but it's not necessarily serving a charitable purpose, and it's usually a recreational organization. And of course, a for-profit, I think that one's pretty easy to wrap your head around. It's more like a traditional business that operates with the goal of making money through selling a service or a product, and that can be a corporation, LLC, sole proprietorship, or a partnership. So how exactly do you apply to be a nonprofit? This is not something that I did throughout my capstone, but I did do a lot of research for it because it's important to understand the different ways to get funded for this. Because of course, it would be nice to do this just from a volunteer standpoint, but occupational therapists also need to be paid for their services. So how exactly do you establish a nonprofit? First of all, first and foremost, all the advice that I gathered from researching on this said that it is beneficial to have a tax attorney that is specifically aware of exactly all these different all the different documentation, all the different steps that you have to take in order to do this process correctly. So first, you're going to establish a nonprofit corporation, filing articles of incorporation. You need to obtain an employer identification number and prepare bylaws, which the board of directors will follow. So the board of directors also is sort of the council that governs the nonprofit and ensures that the nonprofit is following all of the standards, the mission, and the vision that that was set for the organization. Now, you also have to file the IRS form 1023, and this is specifically where it is highly recommended that you get an IRS tax attorney involved in order to ensure that you're doing everything correctly. And you want to state any compliance issues, so charitable solicitations, registration, state any corporation tax exemptions. Now moving into grants. So I mentioned before that a lot of times grants are easier to access when you're a nonprofit, but there, of course, are ways that you can access grants as a for-profit or different sort of organization. First, when you're just searching for a grant, it's really important to use broad search terms. So think about, in the broadest sense of the term, what exactly is your objective for your program? What are you trying to accomplish and what are you trying to address? So with Later, we are targeting justice-involved individuals to expand occupational therapy services to this population. And what exactly is this population dealing with pretty often? All of the things that I talked about before, managing mental health concerns, also physical health concerns, racial inequity, stigma, and other rehabilitative concerns. So thinking about all of those different things, what are some broad terms that maybe one can use? So rather than saying something like occupational therapy and justice involved individuals, you might just say mental health and see what comes out of that. So the reason that I'm giving this advice is because being too narrow in your search terms can really keep you from finding grants that do meet the criteria and that your organization would be able to apply for. And being as broad as possible is able to just cast a wider net and search through and filter through other grants that maybe don't apply, but you don't want to be excluding anything that you could apply to. So it's also important to look at your eligibility for grants. So this is what I was talking about. Is it specific to nonprofit organizations, or can it be for a small business? Is research required? So if your organization isn't associated with any sort of research, any research entity such as a school or a university, that might be important for you to think about. Also, what geographic location is this grant for? Some grants are specific to the United States, some are specific to outside of the country, some are local grants, some are state grants, and is a certain level of experience needed. So sometimes the primary investigator needs to have a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of years in this field of study, or needs to have a certain degree. And other requirements for grant submission is a letter of intent required, what additional information is needed. And this is really important. A good idea to think about is to review the frequently asked questions if available in order to ensure that your organization, your program is actually eligible for this grant, because it would be kind of heartbreaking to go through the whole process and then realize at the end that, oh, they actually don't take a for-profit organization, or I don't have the necessary requirements to meet this grant criteria. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about my deliverables. One of the things that I completed as a deliverable for understanding all of this was a specific aims page. So I specifically wrote the specific aims page to address substance use disorders among justice involved individuals, creating an occupational therapy program for that. And this is just beneficial for future use. And I also created a funding page with little tips and information for students and practitioners that are hoping to create a community mental health program. These are some of my references for things that I spoke on, and just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this video. And if you have any comments or questions, you can leave them down below. Thank you.